Hey everyone. Um, Today I'm going to read a bit from Marxism and Freedom from 1776 until today by Raya Dunayevskaya. I'm not going to read the entire book, and besides, I think that someone has made an audiobook uh, of this book already on YouTube. For my purposes, I'm just reading the sections that are relevant to the Russian question. Um, so it's not even this full part. It's the part five of the book is titled "The Problem of Our Age: State Capitalism versus Freedom," and there's the first part's on Russia and the second part's on the United States. I might read the one on the United States eventually, but for right now, I'm just focusing on what is said about Russia. So yeah. So section one, the Russian scene. In the background of the 1920 to 21 trade union debate hovered the question of, quote, planning, end quote. Despite Trotsky's later claim, it is not true that he had been the first to propose a, quote, single national economic plan, end quote. The, quote, necessity of a single national plan, end quote, appeared in the new program, that is to say, the first program of the newly reorganized Communist Party following the successful 1917 revolution. However, it is true that the whole question of planning, with the exception of that for the critical electric industry, Goelro, was unreal when the working class was the soldiery defending the country. Trotsky was the first to reintroduce the idea of the, quote, single national plan, end quote, as something concrete. In his speech to the Ninth Congress of the Russian Communist Party in March 1920, Trotsky said, "If we are serious about talking about planned economy, which is planned from the center, with a single thought, then manpower is distributed in accordance with a national economic plan on a given stage of development. Then the working mass cannot be wandering Russians. It must be moved about, appointed, commanded, exactly like soldiers," end quote. This conception permeated all Trotsky's speeches during the entire trade union debate. It is this which Lenin continued to oppose to his dying day. On December 22, 1920, Trotsky addressed the Eighth Congress of Soviets. In Trotsky's speech, quote, "The road to a single economic plan," end quote, his administrative conception came out clearly enough in the formulation, quote, "It is necessary to guarantee the unity of leadership in all economic commissariats," end quote. This administrative conception had been in Trotsky's propositions from the start when Trotsky first introduced into the leadership the idea of both planning and free trade. When Lenin, quote, came around, end quote, to the idea of a single national plan, Lenin repeated his objection, quote, "but not administratively, not in uniting the commissariats," end quote, rather in, quote, "drawing in the broadest possible masses," end quote. Even during the Kronstadt Mutiny and the introduction of the new economic policy, the resolution of the 10th Congress considers necessary the realization of the following organizational measures. 1. Participation of the trade unions in the working out of a single economic plan and production program, and equal participation in the practical leadership by the realization and execution of these programs. 2. The formation of economic organizations. The organization of management of industry is formed by agreement between the trade union and the corresponding economic organs on the basis of proposals of the trade unions," end quote. In a word, the two opposing conceptions of plan, which Marx and Capital had first analyzed as the despotic plan of capital and the plan of cooperative labor, were being fought out in life rather than in theory in the most unusual circumstances of a worker state with bureaucratic distortions allowing private trade. After the death of Lenin, the development of the new economic policy proceeded according to its own dialectic. Began as a limited measure to allow the worker state a breather. It ended in the usual growth of capital and the worst native conditions of the workers. Trotsky then introduced the question of plan, this time to curb private trade and give a greater role to the workers, or at least the workers' state. Stalin's opposition was purely factional. He was with Bukharin, who had maintained that Russia could not reach maintained that Russia could reach socialism, quote, at a snail's pace, end quote. But Trotsky was no sooner expelled than the plan, with a capital P, end quote, was introduced. Stalin became the planner, capital P planner extraordinary. To the extent that Trotsky clung to the, quote, plan, end quote, to that extent, despite his constant criticisms of the, quote, tempo, end quote, Trotsky was in actuality a prisoner of Stalin's plan. In the process, the very concept of socialism was reduced to the concept of plan. Capital P plan. At the same time, on a world scale, the 1929 crash brought forth a flood of, quote, a flood of capital P plans, from New Deal alphabetical agencies to Japan's co-prosperity sphere. The theoretical problems Marx had posed nearly a century ago of the centralization of capital, quote, into the hands of one capitalist or one capitalist corporation, end quote, the unemployed army and the breakdown of capitalism had become concrete and crucial. During the Long Depression, thousands of American intellectuals turned towards Marxism and Leninism. They met Stalinist communism, which spent an incredible amount of time, care, energy, and vigilance to confine Marx and Lenin within the bounds of its warped philosophy that private property equals capitalism and state property equals socialism. Because Trotsky's conception that worker states equal state property was not fundamentally different from the Stalinist thesis, it could not become an independent polarizing force despite his continuous struggle against the Stalinist bureaucracy. The result was that Russia continued to parade as if it were something different from capitalism, as if state capitalism was the new society of socialism rather than the ultimate development of capitalism. Indeed, the analysis of the Russian 5-year plans and therefore of the law of motion of the Russian economy originally made by this author to prove state capitalism in Russia was disregarded by academic economists and Trotskyists alike. It is only with the Cold War since the end of World War II that the academic economists took a second look at Russia and the phrase, quote, state capitalism, end quote, has suddenly become almost a journalistic cliche. Economics, however, is once again running a losing race against history, for by now it is not the, quote, economics, end quote, of Marx, but is humanism, capital H, which has assumed concreteness. This is the crucial question which Russian communism must avoid like the plague, a concrete study of the actual development of the capital P plans and of the unplanned revolts against those plans will show why. Chapter 13. So this piece, and besides that introduction, my plan is that I'm going to release these chapters all as individual pieces, but this is chapter 13, so when this chapter is over, the video will also be over. The title of chapter 13 is Russian State Capitalism vs. Workers' Revolt. Section A. The first 5-year plan, relations between planners and workers, 1928 to 32. The first 5-year plan was introduced in October 1928, shortly after Stalin emerged as the complete victor over all competing tendencies in the Russian Communist Party. The internal struggle had been unloosened with Lenin's death and ended for a time with the exile of Trotsky and the imprisonment of his left opposition. For a brief moment, the first few months of the plan, the Russian workers welcomed the end of the new economic policy and the beginning of what they thought would be socialist planning. They were indeed so enthusiastic that they overfulfilled all, quote, norms and, quote, quotas of production as set by the state plan. The workers had gained the 7-hour day, workers' conflict commissions were still functioning and in general favored workers in their fight with management. On January 5, 1929, for example, Economic Life, organ of the Council of Labor and Defense, emphasized that piecework rates were subject to the approval of the Workers' Conflict Commission. The responsibility for fulfilling the financial program, on the other hand, rested exclusively with management. That issue of the publication who also reported that it was an ordinary occurrence for workers who were dismissed by management to be reinstated by the labor inspector. A new decree on the 24th of January made workers responsible for damaged goods. The state planners ordered the 5-year plan to be completed in 4. This speed-up became the sharp point of division between planner and worker. The state planners called 1929, quote, the year of decision and transformation, end quote. That was certainly fact. From then on, the execution of the state plan turned into an endless battle between the state planners and the workers. The two antagonist plans inherent in capitalist production, that of the workers and that of the management hierarchy, came to the fore. The planners struck out against workers' resistance to plan. The planners, capital P planners, eliminated workers' production conferences with their conflict commissions. Instead, production conferences were instituted between engineers and managers presided over by the politicians. At the same time, trials of professionals began. A number of state plan officials were charged with, quote, wrecking, end quote. This was the preview of that distinctive feature of state capitalism, confessions and recantations. It's a very bizarre thing to say, I think. The distinctive feature of state capitalism being confessions and recantations. It seems like it should, something like capital or money or commodity production or accumulation or surplus value or profit or something like that should be the distinctive feature of state capitalism. But let's read on. It was lost upon the world because of the 1929 crash. The world crisis, in turn, adversely affected the price Russian wheat could command on the world market. Money was short for the purchase of tractors. This was crucial for the plan since tractors were not manufactured rapidly enough in Russia to take the place of draft animals. The peasants and the peasants' resistance to collectivization carried out such mass slaughter of animals that Russia has not recovered to this day. The vast extent of this slaughter of animals was first revealed in Stalin's reports to the 17th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1939. Let's see if there's anything special on the internet about 17th Party Congress, USSR. The 17th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks was held during the 26th of January to the 10th of February 1934. The Congress was attended by 1,225 delegates with a casting vote and 736 delegates with a consultative vote, representing 1,872,488 party members and 935,298 candidate members. So back to the text. The vast extent of this slaughter of animals was first revealed in Stalin's report to the 17th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1934. Millions of head, the numbers for horses in 1930, 3.9, the number of horses in 1928 was 33.9. The number of horses in 1932 was 19.6 million. Large horned cattle were 70.5 million and in 1928, and large horned cattle made up 40.7 million in 1932. Sheep and goats constituted 146.7 million in 1928 and 52 million in 1932. So in 1928, 146.7. In 1932, 52 million. Pigs, 26 million in 1928. Pigs, 11.6 million in 1932. There was such havoc on the countryside that the grain harvest declined from 83.5 million tons in 1930 to 70 million tons in 1931. The planners never admitted the terrible famine of 1932 to 33. They destroyed the census rather than reveal the numbers who perished. That's actually very interesting because, that's a distinction. There was another big famine in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, but they made that known to the international community and were able to get some help with that. There was no international help for the terrible famine of 1932 to 33. I can't remember the exact number of people who died in that famine, but yeah. me look at it. Wikipedia. Wikipedia. The Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933 was a famine in major grain-producing areas of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine and different parts of Russia, including Kazakhstan, Northern Caucasus, Kuban region, Volga region, Southern Urals, West Siberia. Major causes include the forced collectivization of agriculture as part of the first 5-year plan and forced grain procurement from farmers. These factors, in conjunction with a massive investment in heavy industry, decreased the agricultural workforce. Estimates conclude that 5.7 to 8.7 million people died of hunger across the Soviet Union. During the period, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin ordered the kulaks, landowning proprietors, quote, to be liquidated as a class, end quote. As collectivization expanded, the persecution of the kulaks, ongoing since the Russian Civil War, culminated in a massive campaign of state persecution in 1929 to 32, including arrests, deportations, and executions of kulaks. Some kulaks responded with acts of sabotage, such as killing their livestock and destroying crops designated for consumption by factory workers. Despite the vast toll in the early stages, Stalin chose to continue the 5-year plan in collectivization. By 1934, the Soviet Union had established a base of heavy industry at the cost of millions of lives. Some scholars have classified the famines which occurred in Ukraine and Kazakhstan as genocides which were committed by Stalin's government targeting ethnic Ukrainians and Kazakhs. Others dispute the relevance of any ethnic motivation as is frequently implied by that term and focus on other factors such as the class dynamics which existed between the kulaks with strong interest in the ownership of private property. These beliefs were in conflict with the ruling Soviet Communist Party's tenet, which was diametrically opposed to private property. Furthermore, the party's goal of rapid industrialization also played a role in worsening the famine, as it chose to continue industrial growth rather than remedy the famine. As famine spread throughout the Soviet Union, international media began to cover it, with Gareth Jones being the first Western journalist to report on the devastation. Back to the text. In this, quote, year of decision and transformation, end quote, the Russian workers grew increasingly restless. Beginning with 1930, the state hit back and instructed labor exchanges to put workers who leave jobs on their own initiative on a, quote, special list, end quote. That blacklist deprived the workers of unemployment compensation. By October 9th, the unemployment was declared, quote, abolished, end quote. Unemployment compensation was stopped altogether. It became obligatory for factory directors to insert into the worker's paybook the reasons for his dismissal. But nothing could stop the labor turnover. By the end of the first 5-year plan, the labor turnover had reached the staggering figure of 152%, whereupon Russia passed a new decree, quote, to order that a worker be dismissed from the services of a factory establishment, even in the case of 1 day's absenteeism from work without sufficient reasons, and be deprived of the food and goods card issued to him as a member of the staff of the factory or establishment, and also of the use of the lodgings which were allowed to him in the houses belonging to the factory or establishment, end quote. Planner and worker had reached opposite sides of the production perspective. As if stage directed, the Soviet theoretician politicians followed in the footsteps of classical political economy, whose theory Marx stated was, quote, to accumulate, that is, Moses and the prophets, accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake, by the formula classical economy expressed the historical mission of the bourgeoisie and did not for a single instant deceive itself over the birth throes of wealth, end quote. Stalin did not deceive himself either. Stalin was more ruthless because we live in the age of state capitalism. While the basic problem everywhere in the world now is labor productivity, how to get workers to work more, nowhere is it more urgent than in a totalitarian state. That is why it is totalitarian. The next section is titled The Turnover Tax. And I'm going to quickly read the Wikipedia on turnover tax in the Soviet Union. The turnover tax was first introduced during the Soviet tax reform of 1930 to 32, soon after the end of the new economic policy. It is broadly similar to a value-added tax, though its specifics were crafted to serve various Soviet economic planning goals. It was the main overt or explicit tax during much of the Soviet period, providing 104 billion rubles of the total Soviet state incoming revenue of 180 billion rubles in 1940, for example. On June 30th, 1975, the USSR Council of Ministers issued a decree about the turnover tax. One, the turnover tax. There is a parallel between the functioning of a totalitarian state and the origins of private capitalism. In tracing the history of primitive accumulation, Marx concluded that, quote, the only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possessions of modern peoples is their national debt, end quote. Never was this more true than in Russia, where the whole cost of industrialization and militarization has been borne by the people through that ingenious scheme known as the turnover tax. The manner of raising the state treasury to pay for the plan appeared in an innocent enough guise. On December 5, 1929, the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party passed the following resolution, quote, to instruct the People's Commissariat of Finance and Supreme Council of National Economy to draw up a system of taxation and government on the principle of a single tax on profits, end quote. The, quote, single tax on profits, end quote, turned out to have two sections. One, a tax on profits which comprised 9 to 12% of the state budget, and two, a turnover tax which comprised 60 to 80% of the budget. Added to the compulsory deliveries by the collective farms, the turnover tax suffices to finance all industrialization and militarization. The turnover tax is unevenly applied. The turnover tax is lightest on heavy industry and heaviest on bread and agricultural produce. Contrary to usual sales tax, which is a fixed percentage of the base price of the commodity, the turnover tax is a fixed percentage of the total sales value of merchandise, including the amount of tax. In plain language, this means that whereas a 90% sales tax raises the price of merchandise 90%, a 90% turnover tax increases the sales price tenfold. Take bread, which is the staff of life for a Russian worker. In paying a ruble for his kilo of black bread, the Russian worker pays 25 kopecks for the actual cost of the bread, including production, distribution, and delivery. The remaining 75 kopecks of that ruble go to the state as turnover tax. Prices skyrocketed so that the worker was faced with actual starvation. Rationing had to be introduced to assure the manual laborers of getting at least enough food. The dividing line between planters and workers was reaching the breaking point. Stalin, as usual, didn't flinch from his headlong march to capitalistic relations. Far from halting or even slowing down the unbearable tempo of industrialization, the slogan was the 5-year plan in 4. Stalin called for the creation of a new, quote, industrial and technical intelligentsia, end quote. Stalin was very specific and tirelessly repetitious as to what the, quote, new conditions, new tasks, end quote, were. I was seeing if that was a piece that had like a wikipedia, but it doesn't. 1. It was necessary, quote, to end depersonalization, end quote, by displaying, quote, the maximum care for the specialist engineers and technicians, end quote. 2. It was necessary to be done with the foolishness of, quote, equalitarianism, end quote, better pay for better work, end quote. 3. It was necessary to stop the, quote, instability of labor in industry, end quote. A greater differentiation must be made between skilled and unskilled. Quote, wages must be organized in a new way, end quote. 4. Business accounting must be introduced in order that an increase in accumulation and a lowering of production costs be achieved. Quote, such, end quote, continued Stalin in his address to the Conference of Industrial Managers on the 23rd of June 1931, quote, are the new conditions of the development of industry demanding new methods of work and new methods of leadership in our economic construction, end quote. Stalin. Although this was being done with great deliberation and consciousness, let no one assign omniscience to Stalin. There is no doubt that Stalin was making a conscious effort to create, quote, leaders, end quote, quote, managers, quote, organizers, in a word, bosses. However, it took another 4 years before an aristocracy of labor could be created. His iron will was the manifestation of the objective drive of the industrial development. That last sentence was in italics. The first 5-year plan ended 1. Actual famine conditions on the countryside. The first 5-year plan ended with 1. Actual famine conditions on the countryside where Stalin was busy, quote, liquidating the kulaks as a class, end quote. 2. A 152% labor turnover in cities, and 3. The beginnings of a new class called, quote, the industrial and technical intelligentsia, end quote. The country had certainly achieved a rapid degree of industrialization, although we can dismiss the fantastic claims of accomplishments. See statistical abstract at end of chapter. More unplanned for events occurred than those which were planned. The one thing that was certain beyond the pre-adventure of a doubt was the direction in which the economy was developing. There was a continuous preponderance of means of production over means of consumption. What Marx had shown as the principle of capitalist development turned out to be the exact direction of Russian economic development. The planners proudly paraded the relationship achieved between the two major departments of production. And in 1928, the means of production department constituted 44.3% of production, while means of consumption constituted 55.7%. But in 1932, it says, means of production department constituted 52% of the Russian economy, or the Soviet economy, and means of consumption constituted 46.7% of the Russian economy in 1932. On the horizon now appeared the social physiognomy of the new ruling class, which in 1930 Christian Rakovsky, a leader of the left opposition, characterized as follows, quote, a ruling class other than the proletariat is crystallizing before our eyes. The motive force of this singular class is the singular form of private property, state power, end quote. Its specific contribution to capitalist production in general is forced labor. Forced labor camps appeared at the outset of the second 5-year plan. B. The second 5-year plan, the one-party state takes full totalitarian form and completes the counter-revolution. 1. Forced labor camps. Thus, the movement of the Russian economy was along the traditional direction of any capitalism. What greets us, however, in the second 5-year plan is new. That frightful companion of state capitalism, forced labor camps, made its first appearance in a modern industrial society in 1933. I'm going to look up the second 5-year plan real quick, see if there's anything. The second plan, 1932 to 1937. Because of the success made by the first plan, Stalin did not hesitate with going ahead with the second 5-year plan in 1932, although the official start date for the plan was 1933. The second 5-year plan gave heavy industry top priority, putting the Soviet Union not far behind Germany as one of the major steel-producing countries of the world. The city of Magnitogorsk was the fifth largest steel in 1934. The Stakhanovite movement aimed to further increase iron and steel production with the introduction of, quote, state gifts, end quote, for overachievers. Further improvements were made in communications, especially railways, which became faster and more reliable. As was the case with the other 5-year plans, the second was not as successful, failing to reach the recommended production levels in such areas as the coal and oil industries. The second plan employed incentives as well as punishments, and the targets were eased as a reward for the first plan being finished ahead of schedule in only 4 years. With the introduction of child care, mothers were encouraged to work to aid in the plan's success. By 1937, the Tolkachi emerged, occupying a key position, mediating between the enterprises and the commissariat. Consistent with the Soviet doctrine of state atheism, this 5-year plan from 1932 to 1937 also included the liquidation of houses of worship with the goals of closing churches between 1932 to 33 and the elimination of clergy by 1935 to 36. The second 5-year plan, 1933 to 1937, introduced an incentive scheme to persuade all the peasants to join collective farms. They were each allowed a small plot of land for their own use. This led to a recovery in agricultural production as the peasants produced fruit, vegetables, meat, and milk on their own plots. Okay. Back to the text. In June of that year, 1933, the Commissariat of Labor was abolished and the trade unions were incorporated as part of the state machinery. 5 weeks later, on the 1st of August 1933, and through the euphemistic title of the Labor Corrective Code, we find listed as, quote, places of detention, end quote, quote, corrective colonies, factory colonies, agricultural colonies, colonies of mass work, and penalty colonies, end quote. The purpose, quote, factory colonies are organized for the purpose of inculcating labor habits, end quote. By the 10th of July 1934, the Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD, was created to take the place of the OGPU, Secret Police. It was given the additional duty of forming a, quote, Department of Correctional and Labor Camps and Labor Settlements, end quote. On the 27th of October 1934, this was supplemented by a resolution of the Central Executive Committee and Council of People's Commissars as follows, quote, all correction institutions, prisons, isolators, correction colonies, and the bureaus of correction work without deprivation of freedom, which are at present managed by the People's Commissariat of Justice of each constituent republic, are to be transferred to the competence of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and its local organs, end quote. The, quote, Commissariat of Justice, end quote, is nothing but a tool of the GPU, which had been transformed into the NKVD, so that from now on party purges, arrest, exile, as well as inculcating, quote, labor habits, end quote, are all, quote, coordinated, end quote. The image of the one-party state ruling class now loomed inside every factory and hamlet and school. Not even minors were spared. The death penalty was introduced for, quote, minors from age 12, end quote. Two, the Stakhanovite speed demons. The first year of the second 5-year plan had begun on April 28, 1933, with the ordering of a party purge. The purge lasted no less than 2 years and completely transformed what was left of the Bolshevik Party. The trade unions, as we saw, had already been abolished. They were blamed for the resistance of the workers to the norms set by the plan. The terrible famine of the countryside drove millions of peasants to the city, creating a considerable army of, quote, surplus labor, end quote. In an effort to halt this disrupting flow of peasants into the city, the planners introduced the system of internal passports. At the same time, they looked to this army of surplus labor to offset the low productivity in the factories. On the 16th of March 1933, industry, The organ of the Commissariat of Heavy Industry advised managers that managers now have, quote, a trump card. There are more workers in the shops than is necessary according to plans, end quote. The advice wasn't lost. The struggle between management and workers intensified. And it just says, I'm looking at the Wikipedia, it says, internal passports were used in the Soviet Union for identification of persons for various purposes. In particular, passports were used to control and monitor the place of residence by means of propiska. Officially, propiska was introduced for statistical reasons, since in the planned economy of the Soviet Union, the distributions of goods and services was centralized. The overall distribution of population was to be monitored. For example, a valid propiska was necessary to receive higher education or be employed. Back to the text. Stalin's slogan of 1931, end depersonalization, or better pay for better work, had lain dormant because it could not gain momentum until a piecework system was introduced. Marx had declared that piecework systems were the best suited for the capitalist mode of production. In 1935, Stalin hailed such a system as, quote, a gift from heaven, end quote. V. Maslalouk, then chairman of the State Planning Commission, thus explained the, quote, gift from heaven, end quote. Quote, a plain miner, the Donetsk Bassin, Alexei Stakhanov, in response to Stalin's speech of May 4, 1935, the keynote of which was the care of the human being and which marked the new stage of development of the USSR, produced a new system of labor organization for the extraction of coal. The very first day his method was applied, he cut 102 tons of coal in one shift of 6 hours instead of the established rate of 7 tons. Jesus Christ. End quote. In the 4 months that elapsed between Stalin's speech of May 4th and Stakhanov's achievement on August 31st, the state did not miss a single publicity trick in setting up this, quote, miracle, end quote. The press, photographers, the wires of the world all immediately heard of the, quote, gift from heaven, end quote. What they did not hear was about the hothouse conditions that were created to enable Stakhanov to become a speed demon. 1. Stakhanov and subsequent Stakhanovites received the finest tools and ruined those tools at the fastest pace without having to pay for them. The average production worker, on the other hand, must pay for all goods he damages. 2. A brigade of helpers do all the detail work, they get no extra money. 3. Above everything, those record breakers for a day do not repeat their records. They retire to swivel chairs. The mass of workers are now told that the, quote, miracle, end quote, must be the, quote, norm, end quote. Armed with Stakhanovism, the state was able to revive the 1931 slogan, quote, end depersonalization, end quote, or, quote, train the recalcitrant factory hands, end quote, as the capitalist philosopher Ura expressed it more honestly in the days of the Industrial Revolution. Piecework was made the prevailing system of work. In the early worker state, the pay differential from the lowest paid worker to the highest ranged from 1 to 3. With Stakhanovism, the range became 1 to 20. Quote, ending depersonalization, end quote, and creating this extreme differentiation in pay would, however, mean nothing if rationing was still in effect and the Stakhanovites could buy nothing with their money. Thereupon, rationing was ended and the production of luxury goods extended. It has a little list of here. It says, so in 1932, I don't know what the hell this. I don't know if these are just the straight up numbers or if they're millions or what. I don't know. But it says in 1932, 65,000 watches were produced. In 1936, 558,000 watches were produced. In 1932, 58,000 gramophones were produced. In 1936, 337,000 gramophones were produced. In 1932, 30,000 cameras were produced, and in 1936, 557,000 cameras were produced. In 1932, 21.5 million meters of silk were produced. In 1936, 51,220 million meters of silk were produced. The average worker continued to eat black bread and have his kipyatok, hot water. Given this base and with the given aim, it was impossible simultaneously to extend production of the means of production as well as production of the means of consumption. On the other hand, one or the other had to be sacrificed. It was so under competitive, quote, market, end quote, capitalism. It proved to be so under autarkic statified production. The constant necessity to expand in order to, quote, catch up with and outdistance the capitalist lands, end quote, the high organic composition of capital in the advanced capitalist world, which imposed the same technical composition upon the Russian economy, all these demanded sacrifice in the sphere of producing articles for mass consumption. Distribution of articles for mass consumption had to be brought into conformity with the reality of the stage of production. It was not a question, as Trotsky thought, of, quote, bourgeois norms of distribution, end quote. It was a matter of the bourgeois method of production. In his preface to Capital, Marx explained that he did not paint the capitalist and landlord in, quote, rosy colors, end quote, not because as individuals they were necessarily evil, quote, but here individuals are dealt with only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relationships and class interests, end quote. 3. Stalin's constitution on the, quote, classless, end quote, intelligentsia. The mid-30s saw the emergence of a, quote, new type of Soviet man, end quote, the type of executive administrator familiar enough in the Western world as, quote, the man in the gray flannel suit, end quote. He made clear by his everyday behavior how different he was from the workers, as if giving bodily form to what Marx called, quote, the strictly regulating authority of the social mechanism of the labor process graduated into a complete hierarchy, end quote. This gentleman of the, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, acted the part as if it were made for him. In this hierarchic structure of the labor process, the, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, serve the plan. The norms are to be fulfilled by others, the great mass of the population. The compelling needs of capitalist value production made them of the mold of all rulers. They bear as little resemblance to the men and women who led the revolution as Napoleon bore to the sans-culotte. I think that's how you say that. I'm not sure. The Russian workers know that the job of factory director is not, as the planners put it, merely, quote, functional, end quote. The extreme income differentials of 1 to 20 are a starter. The, quote, mass, end quote, base of the present regime is wider than that under the czars, but the top echelons constitute, as we shall see in a moment, a bare 2.05% of the total population. In 1935, Molotov boasted that there were 1,751,000, quote, leading positions, end quote, in the Soviet Union, and, quote, 250,000, end quote, quote, 250,000 engineers and architects without personal responsibility for enterprises or projects, end quote. By 1939, Molotov achieved a precision that can come only from extreme ruling class consciousness. The specificity in enumerating the hierarchy of skills and responsibility is a reflection of the class structure as enshrined in the constitution of the land, which differentiates between workers and peasants on the one hand and the, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, on the other. There's a little chart here that says, breaks down the aristocracy of labor thousands. There were 97.6 thousand heads of tractor brigades, 549,600 heads of field brigades, 103,100 heads of livestock brigades, 803,100 tractor drivers and combine operators, and 5,374,400 skilled laborers in industry, including metal workers, lathe operators, welders, and molders, totaling 6,927,800 members of the aristocracy of labor. And then it just has regular employees. It just has quote employees, end quote, thousands. Economists and statisticians, 822,000. Legal personnel, judges, attorneys, 46,000. Engineers, architects, excluding those acting as directors, 250,000. Doctors and middle medical personnel, 762,000. Middle technical personnel, 836,000. Agro-technical personnel, 96,000. Teachers, 1,207,000. Cultural and technical workers, 495,000. That includes journalists, librarians, and club directors. And 46,000 art workers, and 1,769,000 bookkeepers, accountants, etc. Total 6,329,000. And then the final chart says advanced intelligentsia, thousands. Factory directors and managers, Kolkhoz, Sovkhoz, and MTS presidents, 1,751,000. Agronomists, 80,000. Scientific workers, including supervisors, professors, 93,000. Others, including Army intelligentsia, 1,550,000, for a total of 3,474,000. We see revealed here that approximately 16.7 million, or less than 10% of the total population, are considered to be the, quote, classless intelligentsia, end quote, in the broadest sense of the word. The, quote, most advanced, end quote, of the intelligentsia, quote, the genuine creators of a new life, end quote, as Moscow called them. Those who are the real bosses over the economy constitute a mere 3.4 million, or 2.05% of the total population. The remaining 8% share in the surplus value and sing the praises of the rulers, to whom they leave the running of the economy and the state, setting policy and making plans. Even without marking this, quote, advanced, end quote, section, quote, exploiters, end quote, the social physiognomy of the ruling class is clear enough. The, quote, classless intelligentsia, end quote, had now to be given legitimacy. In 1936, the Stalin Constitution did just that. It is in direct opposition to the early Constitution, which bore witness to the transitional character of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the following words, quote, the principal object of the Constitution of the RSFSR, which is adapted to the present transition period, consists in the establishment of the dictatorship of the urban and rural proletariat and the poorest peasantry in the form of the strong all-Russian power, with the aim of securing the complete suppression of the bourgeoisie, the abolition of exploitation of man by man, and the establishment of socialism, under which there shall be neither class division nor state authority, end quote. The new, quote, Stalin Constitution, end quote, on the other hand, while claiming that, quote, socialism was irrevocably established, end quote, nevertheless strengthened the state authority in the form of complete totalitarianism, It established piecework as the reigning system, quote, from each according to his abilities to each according to his work, end quote. It decreed the protection of state property and personal property from, quote, thieves and misappropriators, end quote. Far from the withering away of this state, this octopus will first gorge itself on what is left of the revolution and on the workers who dare to resist. The Moscow trials will literally liquidate the, quote, general staff, end quote, who led the revolution. The ruling bureaucracy let loose with a series of macabre trials, the like of which has not been seen since the Spanish Inquisition and the hunt for witches. These trials had all the added terrorism, violence, and shamelessness that only a totalitarian state can produce. First was the Zinoviev-Kamenev trial, then the Radik-Pyatakov and Bukharin-Rykov trials, then the trial in camera of the military staff, headed by Tukhachevsky, and finally the trial of the Yagodas, who staged the first set of trials. The fantastic confessions and debasement of the, quote, general staff of the revolution, end quote, who had long since capitulated and recapitulated and been isolated and imprisoned, were without stature or dignity, added up to the extermination of the memory of revolution in some men and helped to complete the rewriting of history. But it was not for, quote, history, end quote, that all this was staged. The full totalitarian state had taken shape. It was throwing its weight around. It needed the bloodletting in order to install firmly the new class created by the, quote, new, end quote, method of production. Nor was the greatest frame-up in history limited to the men who led the revolution. Quite the contrary, its full fury was unloosed against the workers. The mass graves discovered at the end of the war bear terrifying witness to that. The millions who filled and fill the concentration camps show that the Moscow trials did not change the workers' attitudes to the totalitarian state. The Moscow trials were the culmination of the counter-revolution that we saw developing early in the changed relations of production. A hangman's noose rather than a full army sufficed because only one of the parties to this conflict was armed. Whatever had been left of the October Revolution was exterminated and the proletarian state overthrown, not so much by the execution of the old Bolsheviks, although that is always a manifestation of counter-revolution, but by clearing a place in the process of production for the new class. That place could have been cleared for the, quote, classless intelligentsia, end quote, only where such a full-blown class had already come into existence, only where the method of production itself called that classless intelligentsia forth. I guess maybe the full-blown class forth. The production relations established by the revolution had long become incompatible with this new method of production. That is why the bloodbath came at the end of the second five-year plan. The Russian worker knows that the production relations of state property demand his sweat and degradation. That state bears as much resemblance to a worker state as the President of the United States Steel Corporation does to a steel worker, just because they are both, quote, employees, end quote, of the same corporation. The counter-revolution of 1935 to 1937 was the culmination of what began with the introduction of the plan. The plan brought worker and manager into immediate conflict. The liquidation of the trade unions into the state apparatus symbolized the unbridgeable gulf between planner and worker. Stakhanovites, engineers and administrators in production, and officers in the army joined those in the state to form the bulwark of the new ruling class, which was given juridical status, that is, legitimacy, in the Soviet Constitution of 1936. The experience of Russia since 1936 has exploded the idea that planning by any other class than the proletariat can ever reverse the law of motion of capitalist society. C. The third five-year plan and a summation of all the plans at the outbreak of war. Actually, I'm going to take a break. I'll restart for next time. C. The third five-year plan and a summation of all the plans at the outbreak of war. Russia has achieved great industrial growth. The claims made by the Russians, however, are very questionable. The agricultural collapse in 1932, e.g., is listed as the plan 93% fulfilled. Since it did not figure as part of the planners simply ignored the drastic slaughter of livestock greater than the decrease between 1914 and 1920 due to the war, revolution, civil war, and famine. Since there were always more unplanned things occurring than planned things, the planners simply took the average, end quote, of a basic industry which had overshot its mark, quote, 103%, end quote, plus an uncompleted house which could not be lived in at all. It was thus easy for them to declare all sorts of, quote, accomplishments, end quote. 2 plus 2 equals anything they wanted to equal. Prior to World War II, however, criticism of the Russian method of measuring industrial growth was not widely believed because Russia alone seemed to be growing while the rest of the world was unable to get out of the throes of the Long Depression. The Russian economists referred to the reported 650% achievements of Soviet industrialization, but an index of total industrial production which carefully weights each element in the economy in order to arrive at a statistically valid index of the volume of production has never been prepared by the Russian economists. This task, never easy under ordinary circumstances, is especially difficult in the case of Soviet statistics, which are concealed or perverted to prove the correctness of the, quote, general line, end quote. Under these circumstances, the best available gauge is to compare physical output of selected sections of both industry and light industry as well as agricultural production against a background of statistics on population and national income. Below is an abstract of the USSR prepared by this author to illustrate the course of development for the whole economy from Tsarist times through 1940. Figures for the year 1922 have been included in order to show the accelerated pace of the growth of production from the year of ruin following the end of counter-revolution and famine to the eve of the first five-year plan. All data are from official state documents in the original Russian, 1913, 1922, and 1928 figures from Gosplan, State Planning Commission for the Development of the National Economy of the USSR, the five-year plan, 1932 and 37, figures from Gosplan, results of the respective plans, 1940 figures from reports to the 18th Conference of the Russian Communist Party, appearing in Pravda, February 18th to the 21st of 1941. Yeah, there's some charts here that I'm not going to try to explain. The value of gross industrial production in billions of rubles fixed 26 to 1927 prices reveal the following proportional development of the means of production, Group A, to the means of consumption, Group B, since the initiative of the first five-year plans. Yeah, there's a chart here. I'm trying to figure out what it's saying. It basically shows that in 1928, the means of production department constituted 44.3%, and in 1940 it constituted 61%. And in 1928, the means of consumption department constituted 55.7%, and the means of production department, the means of consumption department went from 55.7% of the economy in 1928 to 39% of the economy in 1940. The statistical measurement of the Russian economy is presented here not in order to enter the field of dispute as to the phenomenal or non-phenomenal development of Russian industrialization, nor, as important as they may be, is the author interested in the correct weighting of the official figures. The fundamental purpose of this table of Russian industrialization, rather, was to show the direction in which the Russian economy moved during the years of the plans before World War II brought its devastation. It is clear from this that the direction of its growth, the preponderance of means of production over means of consumption, the high organic composition of capital, and the rapid deterioration of the living standards of the masses is neither accidental nor due to, quote, war conditions, end quote, but was the inevitable consequence of the law of motion of that economy which, like any other capitalist economy, rests on paying the worker at minimum and extracting from him the maximum. Okay. Looking at... There's some footnotes here that I missed. The first says, this is not based on the unit which was used for previous years, since for 1933, for reasons best known to the Russian state and unrevealed to the public, a measure known as the, quote, biological yield, end quote, was adopted. This standard of measurement meant that the grain was estimated on the stalks in the field before harvesting, and 10% deduction allowed for waste. All agricultural economists, with the exception of the communists, agree that such an estimate does not account for actual waste. Some discount 20%, others as high as 30 to 40%. However, this abstract reports official figures only. Says 1930. Next footnote says 1937 census was destroyed and data were not made available to public. And the next footnote says Russian statistics lump workers and employees into one category, or when they separate them into two categories, they lump rural and urban workers into one category and rural and urban employees into another. The above figures represent urban workers and employees. End footnote. From the statistical table, it was seen that this author's estimate of the real weekly wages of the average Russian worker in 1940 was only 62.4% that of 1913. This point can be made more graphic by showing that food, which takes most of his pay, cost a Russian worker. An average 1926 study provided the information as to the foods an average Moscow worker consumed. The publication of the food index in Russia was stopped in 1930. However, with the abolition of rationing, the prices of the main commodities were published. Further data in regard to the rise in retail prices in government stores in Moscow 1939 and 1940 were gathered by the American Embassy and published in the November 1939 and May and August 1940 issues of the Monthly Labor Review. From the food prices against wages, a true picture of the conditions of the Russian workers will emerge. Sorry, there's a chart here. Hopefully this text below it explains the chart. Using 1913 as 100, the index of the cost of food for 1928 is 187, and for 1940, 2,248. The weekly wages for those years were 1913, 6 rubles, 1928, 14 rubles, and 1940, 83 rubles. Again, using 1913 as our base year for nominally weekly wages, we have an index for 1928 of 233 and for 1940 of 1,383. We can now construct our index of real wages by dividing the nominal weekly wage into the real cost of food, thus obtaining 125 as the index of real wages in 1928 and 62.4% for 1940 when compared to Tsarist times. Had we considered the further rise in food prices by October 1940, it would have been a mere 55% of 1913. And when even that appallingly low figure, which so glaringly proves the deterioration in the workers' standard of living, does not picture the situation at its worst, for we have considered the single uniform price in 1940 and not the open market price to which the workers sometimes had to resort because few foods were available in state stores. On the average, the open market prices were 78% higher than the state store prices. There is supposed to be no black market in Russia, but in the officially recognized free market, beefsteak sold for 17 rubles a kilo, when the state stores sold the same commodity at 10.5 rubles. At the same time, industrial development has not brought Russia out of its backwardness when judged by per capita production. These comparative figures by Molotov in 1937 make the point. And there's a chart. It's too long to try to talk about. In presenting the third five-year plan, therefore, Molotov made per capita production the key word. Quote, people here and there forgot that economically, that is from the point of view of the volume of industrial output per capita of the population, we are still behind some capitalist countries. Socialism has been built in the USSR, but only in the main. We have still a very great deal to do before the USSR is properly supplied with all that is necessary. Before we raise our country economically as well as technically to the level not only as high as that of the foremost capitalist countries, but considerably higher, end quote. The slogan of the first five-year plan, quote, to catch up with and outdistance the capitalist lands, end quote, held for the second plan and remained for the third plan. Again, the unpardonable sin was the Russian workers' attitude to work under the plan. Molotov knows better than anyone that to accomplish what they did in the first plan, they were forced to use 22.8 million workers, whereas the plan called for only 15.7 million. Molotov knows that the low labor productivity of the Russian worker is not a sign of his backwardness, but a sign of his continuous revolt against the conditions of production. New section 1. Crises and Purges. The fundamental error of those who assume that a single capitalist society is not governed by the same laws as a society composed of individual private property-owning capitalists lies in a failure to realize that what happens in the market is not the cause, but the consequence of the inherent contradictions of the process of production. A single capitalist society does not have an unlimited market. The market for consumption goods, as we have shown, is strictly limited to the luxuries of the rulers and the necessaries of the workers when paid at value. The slogan, quote, to catch up with and outdistance capitalist lands, end quote, was the reflection of the compelling motive of the present world economy. Who will rule over the world market? Therein lies the secret of the growth of the means of production at the expense of the means of consumption. Therein lies the cause for the living standards of the masses growing worse despite the, quote, state's desire, end quote, for what it called, quote, the still better improvement of the conditions of the working class, end quote. Our specific single capitalist society has achieved some highly modern factories, a showy subway, and as Khrushchev assures us, an H-bomb big enough so that if he dropped it over the polar ice caps it would flood the world, but it has not stopped to raise the living standards of the masses of Russian workers. It cannot. Capital will not allow it. Because of this, the economy is in constant crisis. The value of capital in the surrounding world is constantly depreciating, which means that the value of capital inside the capitalist country is constantly depreciating. It may not depreciate fully on the bureaucrat's books. However, since the real value of the product can be no greater than the value of the corresponding plant on the world market, the moment the Ford tractor was put alongside the Stalingrad tractor, the state was to reduce the price of its own brand. This was the case in 1931 when Russia, while importing 90% of the world's production of tractors, sold its own below cost. Of greater importance, and therein lies the essence of Marx's analysis of all economic categories as social categories, is the fact that no matter what figures may appear on the books, the means of production, in the process of production, reveal their true value and their relation to the worker. That is to say, if an obsolete machine is not destroyed but was not destroyed but continued to be used in production, the worker suffers the more since the manager of production still expects him to produce articles at the socially necessary labor time set by the time clock of the world market. As long as planning is governed by the necessity to pay the laborer the minimum necessary for his existence and to extract from the laborer the maximum surplus value in order to maintain the productive system as far as possible within the lawless laws of the world market, governed by the law of value, that is how long capitalist relations of production exist, no matter what you name the social order. It has thus been absolutely impossible for Stalin, as for his heirs, to guide the productive system without sudden stagnation and crises due to the constant necessity of adjusting the individual components of total capital to one another and to the world market. They have avoided the ordinary type of commercial crises, but on the other hand, when the crises came, they were more violent and destructive. Such was the case in 1932 and again in 1937. In 1932, it took the form of complete chaos on the countryside. In 1937, it took the form of the spectacular Moscow trials and the en camera military trials. In both cases, industrial production as planned was as far apart from industrial production as accomplished as heaven is from earth. Purges are not due to the state of mind, but to a state of production. Purges have never ceased in Russia and will never cease under that regime because the crises never cease. The crises never cease because the revolt of the working class is continuous. New section 2. Labor before the law. The party bureaucracy, armed with full state power, began to wreak their vengeance in a new set of anti-labor, quote, labor legislation, end quote, the most oppressive ever recorded in the history of modern times. In the 1940 laws forbid a worker to leave his job. Any infraction of factory discipline, such as coming 15 minutes late, is made punishable by 6 months at, quote, corrective labor, end quote. That is, labor in the factory at 25% reduction in pay. If this law is violated, the worker is sent to forced labor camps. From the workers, the totalitarian bureaucracy moved over to take their vengeance on the youth. Teenagers are taken out of school and given 6 months to 2 years, quote, free vocational training, end quote, at the end of which they were to work where the state directed, the 2 and up to 4 years at the, quote, prevailing rate of pay, end quote. On December 26, 1940, Pravda reported that, particularly in the coal mines, truancies were greater in the first 6 months of the operation of the law than in the previous period. At the 1941 Party Congress, held just a few months before the Nazi attack and after the European war had already been going on for nearly 2 years, the report stated that workers, quote, were constantly absenting themselves, particularly after payday, end quote, and that fully a third did not accomplish their, quote, norms, end quote. This draconian anti-labor legislation records the terror of the ruling bureaucracy in the face of the revolt of the workers. The revolt had begun soon after the inauguration of the first 5-year plan, The workers perform miracles of ingenuity and endurance in resisting the totalitarian stranglehold over production. The peasants do the same on the countryside. Millions in forced labor camps are the true measure of the never-ending resistance of the Russian masses to the Russian rulers in the state, in the factory, and in the fields. Had the revolt not been so persistent, the terror would not have been so violent. D. The war and the assault on Marx's capital. In 1939, Hitler, with his own 3-year plans, his own, quote, end to employment, end quote, his gas chambers and concentration camps, was poised, ready to concentrate all of European capital. Hitler got the go sign from Stalin, and with the Nazi-Soviet pact, launched the war against Poland, which the two dictators carved out between themselves. By 1941, the dictators fell out. Stalin's full imperialist ambitions were not to be met until he joined with the Allies and got what he couldn't get from Hitler, Eastern Europe. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched its attack against Russia. So deep are the antagonisms within Russia that Hitler marched up to Stalingrad before the Russian people chose to turn the invaders back rather than suffer the added torment of foreign rule. But the Russian planners did not change. Nor did the Russian planners stop at taking away the workers' 7-hour day and making 8 hours the regular workday for obligatory, quote, overtime, end quote. In fact, the slogan was, quote, no distinction between the front and the rear, end quote. The insatiable hunger for, quote, production and more production, end quote, lost all bounds right in the midst of war when the bureaucracy discovered the conveyor belt system. The year 1943 is officially referred to as the quote, year of the conveyor belt system, end quote. The assembly line technique was used to transform the individual breakneck competition of Stakhanovism into, quote, socialist emulation, end quote. That is, factory-to-factory competition. No labor worker could see... why did I say no labor worker? That's weird. No Russian worker could see the difference between his, quote, socialist labor, end quote, and that which was described by Marx as capitalistic alienated labor. The questions asked by students were likewise unanswerable, hence the teaching of political economy was stopped altogether. In the year that they discovered the conveyor belt system, the totalitarian theoreticians were emboldened to lay their brutal hands on Marx's capital. They ordered that the dialectical structure of capital no longer be followed, that they now said that the law of value functions in the, quote, land of socialism, end quote. Heretofore, everyone, friend and foe, Marxist and non-Marxist alike, agreed that Marx's law of value was the characteristic mark of capitalist society. For that very reason, Russian theoreticians, until the publication of this 1943 article, claimed that the law of value did not operate in their country, which they declared to be, quote, the land of socialism, end quote. Now the Russian theoreticians found themselves in the dilemma of refusing to depart from the claim that Russia is, quote, socialist, end quote, yet at the same time suddenly admitting that the law of value does operate in Russia. For a Marxist, that would be an impossible situation. For a Russian communist, however, it was a blessing for Russian theory, was finally squared with Russian reality. As I wrote in my commentary then, quote, the ideas and methodology of the article are not identical. They are the methodology of a, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, concerned with the acquisition of, quote, surplus products, end quote. That is, what is important is that this departure from, quote, past teaching of political economy, end quote, actually mirrors economic reality. The Soviet Union has entered the period of, quote, applied economics, end quote. Instead of theory, the article presents an administrative formula for minimum cost and maximum production. It is the constitution of Russia's post-war economy, end quote. It is true that the theoreticians thought they would solve their main problems of explaining away the functioning of the capitalistic law of value. However, the theoretical change of front is the last important aspect of the startling reversal in theory. Take, for example, the proposal that henceforth the teaching of capital should not begin with Chapter 1, which includes this famous section of the fetishism of commodities. The fetishism of commodities is the mystery with which the social relations of production are clothed in bourgeois society. In Russia, where the society is completely state capitalist, the bourgeois fetishism of commodities seems to be overcome. It's fucking weird. It's a weird idea that's like within a capitalist society, commodity fetishism could be overcome. In a sense, it is. The Russian bureaucrats are not affected by problems of the market, nor confused by ideas of equal exchanges as the bourgeois economists. But another aspect of fetishism, the critical one that Marx uncovered, was the perversity of relations between machine and man, where dead labor dominates over living labor. That is why Marx is so insistent in saying that the form of the commodity is fantastic, not because the form of the commodity is not true, but because the form of the commodity correctly reflects the real relations at the point of production. This fetishism not only has not been overcome in Russia, the plan has perfected it and become a prisoner to it. They have substituted for fetishism of commodities the fetishism of the plan, but their plan turns out to be no more than a disguise for the actual relations of production in the factory. They are no more able to overcome this fetishism than are the bourgeois economists. In other words, far from the plan bringing light into the relations of production in the factory, the state planners express in the plan the total domination of the workers by the machine. In reality, therefore, the state plan is nothing but the organization of the proletariat to produce under the domination of the machine. The need to square theory with reality meant one thing for the theoreticians and something else for the Russian workers. The former searched for the proper quotations. The latter knew that nothing at all would be changed for them with the end of the war. The teaching of Marx's Capital would undergo the change. They would have to continue to produce more and more. At the same time, the theoretical vision served notice to the Allies that Russia was, quote, in the market, end quote, for world domination. The theoretic foundation of the Cold War was laid. Never before has so gigantic a state mobilized itself with such murderous vigilance to keep the proletariat at work while the leaders plan. The Russian totalitarian bureaucracy is the most deadly, the most insidious, the most dangerous enemy because it springs from the proletariat and cloaks itself in Marxist terminology. Okay, the end of that chapter. I'm going to break these down into chapters because this part on Russia has chapters, but that was chapter... What's the next chapter? Next chapter is 14, so this chapter was 13. So thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of it.